start off with the announcement that you guys made a few days ago, basically suspending boxing until Jan, the end of Jan. I can potentially see this maybe until February, but how difficult was it to make this decision for a second time?
Extremely difficult. Obviously, these were discussions that had taken place over the Christmas period, so people who you wanted to speak to weren't readily available or working, etc. So it was a difficult decision to make. We are heavily reliant on the NHS with regard to our doctors, and we have obviously many categories of doctors, anaesthetists, sports doctors, neurosurgeons, etc., who obviously are extremely busy now. We rely on the hospitals if, God forbid, anything goes wrong with a boxer. So yes, difficult decision to make, but ultimately I believe it was the right decision to make. It just gives us a bit of breathing space. We haven't really lost many shows. There was 2 confirmed shows, so January generally historically is a relatively quiet period for the sport. So it's just given us a little bit of time to make sure that when we do start, we do have the provisions in place to carry out all the requirements we need. I can update you slightly. We are looking to recommence boxing in the middle of February now, which is good news. That will be hopefully confirmed very, very shortly. We obviously have been dealing with a lot of doctors over the last couple of days with regard to when and how we recommence. That has happened. I have a medical officers meeting on Tuesday, a virtual meeting on Tuesday with all the area representatives, all the area medical officers and our chief medical officer and our advisors to go through an update of our operational document to make sure that we're running as we should be. So, although bad start to the year, I'm very confident it will work out in the end.
That's good news about February. I mean, my next question was that, what sort of professionals do you consult aside from, like you say, your own colleagues and, you've got your medical professionals? I mean, do you consult government officials as well?
Yeah, we've been in contact with the government right from the beginning of March when we shut down. Well, before that, obviously, because we made a decision to shut the sport down on the 17th of March. And obviously, we were discussing a lot of things with the government prior to that. And a lot of things when we started again on the 10th of July, I think it was, 9th or 10th of July, we had a lot of discussions with the DCMS with regard to how we can operate, what we need to do, provisions we have to put in place. And the government are very happy with regard to our provisions in place with regard to testing, putting people in bubbles, etc. So that's the reason why we could get going in July, and it's worked extremely well. The one thing, I had a discussion with somebody the other day, the one thing that people don't realise is that we tested it virtually every week for COVID, for all the officials, all the boxers, all the trainers, and a huge amount of money promoters are putting out in regard to hotels, etc. and whatever. And from the 10th of July to the 30th of September, we had no positive tests whatsoever. But from the 30th of September to the end of December, we had positive tests for COVID every single week. So that was either boxers, trainers, promoters, officials, promoters, staff, etc. So that shows there was something going on around the country, etc. And it hasn't got any better. And in fact, obviously, after I did write to all our promoters prior to the Christmas break, advising them that our doctors expect there will be a increase in the COVID after Christmas and New Year, and lo and behold, there was. So we've been on top of it, but the decision to shut down or not to run in January was a hard one to make. But ultimately, when we take on, there are some things I have to put in place that I'm not very happy about. But when you're taking advice from doctors who are more qualified than I am, then there's no point having them if you don't take that advice. And we took that advice, and quite rightly so.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're making this decision, do you have, so obviously at the moment, virtual meetings with all the promoters and managers that are involved, potentially putting on shows? And if so, did you have much come back from them?
No, right at the beginning of the whole thing, when we decided we are going to start up in July, we had Zoom meetings with every single promoter who at that time wanted to run, and their representatives. So we went through all the procedures we were putting in place. So therefore, they had to put in place their procedures to cover our procedures as such. We haven't had meetings as a group with promoters. I've done everything individually since then. But with regard to our other meetings, yes, we're making. I'm speaking to medical officers, some medical officers, virtually every day. The medical panel is made up of the chief medical officers of each area. The British Boxing Board of Control is split into 7 regions, what we call areas. Each of those areas have a chief medical officer. So they're part of the board's medical panel. On top of that, we have the national chief medical officer, Dr. Ashley Patel. On top of that, we have a head office doctor, Dr. Neil Scott, who comes in, who I take a great deal of advice from. And on top of that, there's another couple of other advisors, doctors who advise me along with regard to different aspects of medical care, etc. So they've been part of that. So these meetings have been taking place virtually every month, and in some cases 2 or 3 times a month. So it's been busy on that front. But the decisions, it's not just like I wake up one morning, well, we're going to do this, because I'm not very happy about that. These decisions are actually thoroughly thought through. Of course, we upset a few people. With regard to the decision in January, no, we've been backed ultimately. I think all the promoters, with what's going on in the country, I think everybody realises that that's possibly more important than sport. Sport is very important to everybody. Boxing is very important to us. I'm a football fan and a rugby fan, and I like all aspects of sport. But we are slightly different than those with regard to the medical cover we have. Slightly different to the type of injuries we may have to deal with, etc. So we took the stance, and what we understand, you know what the result of the stance is, and it was the right one.
Yeah, absolutely. In regards, just taking you back to March, when you had these conversations with the medical professionals and what have you, what sort of hurdles did you have in front of you that they wanted you to put in place in the shows? And did it concern you at all about even putting on shows because of what was going on with this pandemic?
Oh yeah, I must admit, when all this started, I thought this isn't going to work. Knowing how we've run shows before, knowing how we're dealing with human beings ultimately, and it's trying to get through to them the importance of what we were doing. And at the beginning, we were called draconian. These things are too much. What you're putting in place is financially prohibitive. I mean, that's the biggest problem we've got, is the only people who can promote are ultimately those with a TV contract. And to a certain extent, they're obligated by a TV contract. And secondly, they possibly have more money than other small hall promoters who can do that. I mean, my first discussions with I hate the term, but they are the small hall promoters, etc., people who haven't got TV contracts, etc., or broadcasting contracts. My first conversations with them, hand on heart, and people criticise me for not being supportive. Don't run. This is financial suicide. If you run a tournament, this is financial suicide. My job is to make sure that when we get over this, that you can run in the future. And I think that at the moment, promoters aren't spending any money or losing any money because they're not promoting. They're not making any money, even if they want to promote. The people who aren't making any money are the boxers who would be boxing on those shows, etc. So that does concern me. However, some of them have other jobs. They may have lost those jobs as well because of what's going on around the country or around the world. This is not just a British problem. This is a worldwide problem. So, ultimately, I did advise everybody on behalf of the board what we were going through. But I can say, hand on heart, at some points, some of the things that we were being asked to put in place, I thought this just isn't going to work. But it did, and we got it in there with a lot of hard work from everybody. And there was criticism along the way. Some people said we couldn't do it because of the type of sport we are with regard to the contact we have, but we did. And I think as a whole, it's been very successful. Of course, people will tell you differently, but I disagree with that. I think if you look at it, the type of shows we had, I had people criticising some of the matches, but the first tournament we had was in a TV studio with the British Championship. A couple of weeks later, we had somebody running shows in their office garden. You know, after that, we had a show in the Liverpool nightclub with Clifton Mitchell. After that, we did shows at Church Hall in Westminster, ultimately. And then we ended up at Wembley Arena. So what we've achieved, not just as a sport, promoters, officials, boxers, license holders, I think when you look back at it, it's quite remarkable. But then people would say, I would say that anyway, but I think that's the truth.
No, it is, especially, you know, where we've come from. Just you mentioned a couple of things that you said that, you know, you were concerned that weren't going to work. Could you elaborate on those?
Yeah, I think the logistics of the testing was a major issue. We've got people coming from all over the country. I mean, don't forget, Stuart, the biggest thing we had was we were dealing with something that nobody had ever dealt with before. I said at the time, I can walk into any show, and if any problem arises up until that point, I've dealt with it before. Ultimately, maybe come around in a different kind of way, but I have some experience of how to get out of that issue at that particular time, and so do all our officials, etc. We walked into something that we knew nothing about. Ultimately, we went to a show where procedures were in place we'd never done before. The advantage we have this time is we have that experience now. So therefore, it's not such a leap in the dark as it was in July. So that is very advantageous to us. But yes, the testing was a major problem, putting people into hotels, and also the mindset of individuals of how important it was to stick to the criteria of what we put in place. It's not just running the tournaments, it's the perception of how we're running the tournaments, etc. I mean, I can tell you some of the, so I'm not a fan of social media. I am if it's used properly, but I think half the time it's not used properly and everybody there just to shoot people down, which I think is unfortunate. But some of the things that people were putting out on social media when they have no knowledge whatsoever of what's the work that's gone into it and how people are dealing with it and the good people who we're putting in place to do it. Don't forget that the vast majority of board officials are volunteers, just like any other sport. When I used to run a football team, parents and everybody like that are just volunteers, etc. And that's what 90% of the people working boxing on behalf of the British Boxing Board of Control are volunteers. So you're putting a great deal of faith in people to do the right thing. And I commend them, and we couldn't have done it without them. And bearing in mind, we could only really promote shows in only a couple of areas: the central area, which is a busy area, southern area, which is a busy area, and the Midlands area. Every other area in the country hasn't run a show. So those officials we use there have been very patient, and I applaud them.
Just in the lead up to that first show, I think it was Frank Warren that actually put on the first show since the pandemic. Were you nervous? And, you know, when it came to actually the live show itself, what were you feeling? And
I think nervous is apprehensive. I think it's more, I don't know if there's another word for nerves, but I do know the work that Frank had put into it. His employee, Andy Ayling, had done a very, very good job, thorough job. His whole staff had done a very thorough job. So I was confident that they had done a good job. I was confident that we'd done as good a job as we possibly could. But of course, again, until you get there, you don't really know how it's going to pan out. And certainly those first few shows was very much a learning experience. And we have developed as we've gone along and changed a couple of things with regard to our operational document, etc. But no, apprehensive was more of a word. How did I feel? It felt strange, you know, sitting in a TV studio watching boxing. You know, it was the best of a bad thing ultimately, but I think they did a very, very good job. It looked good on TV when I went back and had a look at it. Obviously, you know, sport has to have a crowd ultimately, and all sport is being running without a crowd. So we've all got a problem with that. And people criticising, oh, it's not the same, it's not the same. Well, of course it's not the bloody same. It's completely different, you know. But you've got it if you want it. This is what we've got. And we wanted it. That's what we got. Now, Now, hopefully, I was hoping that by now we could move on. At the Anthony Joshua fight, we had 1,000 people in there. I thought that was a launch pad of moving on, you know, getting everybody else with crowds in there. And lo and behold, you wake up one morning, the whole thing's changed. So, you know, this is a fluid problem we're in, situation we're in, and we've just got to get on with it.
One question that cropped up, I know it was mentioned about social media, but the trainers and the cutmen had to wear masks, like a mask and then a face cover. The question was that if everyone has been tested and everyone's negative, why do they still need to wear like the face covering and the mask in the corner?
Because you cannot be 100% guaranteed that everybody in that venue is at some point may have contact with somebody who hasn't got the COVID virus. You get tested one day and you get the result. Actually, it does not mean you haven't got it, because there's an incubation period, etc. We're just doing, I mean, it's a little bit like when HIV is exactly the same, actually. You get tested, you get the result, but there's a 3-month incubation period as well. I think it's 3 months. So there's a period of time that we don't actually know. So therefore, what we did, we started off at the very highest level with regard to our restrictions and procedures in there. And the reason we did that is because it's easier to reduce than it is to increase. So if you start off at a lower level and try to increase, it's more difficult. You get more objections from people, etc. So yes, everybody was saying to me, well, we've all been tested. We're all negative. What's the problem? Well, I can't guarantee, or nobody can guarantee 100% that nobody in that venue, bearing in mind that not everybody is tested. There's different zones where people can go. There is a possibility that you could walk past somebody who hasn't been tested, etc. So we went to the highest level of security we could. And you know, if people didn't like it, unfortunate. But as I said, boxing was up and running. But I do understand that, and that was one of the criticisms. But there are reasons why.
From the first show that Frank did, I mean, how many tweaks were there until, let's say, the Anthony Joshua card with extra bits and pieces that, you know, to make essentially make it stronger?
Well, we started off very high, so there were a couple of things we could reduce. I mean, one of the things we got criticised for was obviously we stopped anybody who was over 70 going to show. That was one of the conditions, anybody over 70, because they were deemed to be in the higher risk bracket. Also, there was a big list of medical conditions that people who were suffering from should not be going to tournaments, etc. So we started very high. So we were lucky with regard to that. As I said, it's always easier to reduce than it is to increase. And we slowly reduced a couple of things with regard to that. We allowed people who were over 70 but were not suffering from various medical conditions to go, etc. So that was a reduction. But there was a couple of things with regard to where officials sit, where other people are allowed to congregate, etc., or where they can go. We have a red, amber, and green zone. So the green zones is the people who haven't been tested. Then everybody in the red zones has to be tested, have to wear the FFP3 and the visors, etc. That gradually reduced as you went along. So we haven't, I can't think of anything major that was increased. A couple of things were reduced, but on the whole, 90% of the documents, 85% to 90% of the document is the same as when we started.
And when boxing does resume in February, I assume that these same restrictions will stay in place, or if anything, will anything be increased again?
I think there's a possibility that things will be increased, yes. I think the document will change slightly. I'm not going to go into what they will be at the present time. The doctors, as I say, will have a lengthy meeting on next Tuesday. But yes, I would expect there will be a number of things that may be increased for this particular period of time.
Okay, just moving away from that. Obviously, a lot of fighters have not fought this year or last year. How does that work in terms of like renewing licenses and what have you? Is there any extensions, or has there been any extensions, or is there anything in place where when it does come to renew, there might be some sort of help to, especially for the smaller hall guys?
Yes, well, when we stopped in March, all licenses stopped ultimately. So when we started again, we gave them a 3 to 4 month period to. So what happened was the easiest way for us to deal with it was when their license became due, they renewed it, but they got a 3 to 4 months extension next time it was going to be renewed. So yes, there was a renewal system with regard to that, and that still is in place, and that will there'll be an increase in that slightly because of this 6 month ultimately with no boxing. But don't forget, eventually we only lost 2 tournaments, which was at the end of January anyway. There was going to be one at the beginning of February, but that didn't materialise. So if now we start, and hopefully we start in the middle of February, we're back on track to what we were going to have. So we only lost 2 tournaments anyway. The only thing we couldn't change was obviously the annual medicals. As it says, it's an annual medical. We can't extend annual medicals. Simple as that. You know, if your scan is due in December, we can't extend it till March or April. It's got to be done again in December. So, so license fees were extended, medicals were not.
I think, especially on the small hall scene, a lot of the smaller hall fighters, and including journeymen, are not so-called getting out and fighting or getting work. Off the top of your head, do you know how many have, say, retired and just packed in boxing because of what this pandemic has done?
No, that's difficult to tell because a lot of people just haven't renewed the license. You know, so therefore, although a license fee becomes due, not everybody, and I would say the vast majority don't. They only genuinely renew their license when they've got a date to box, which makes things difficult for us because there's always a big rush at the end before to get the date before we can get it cleared for them to box. So no, that's very difficult to say who has actually just thrown in the towel as such. I don't think that many would. Certainly a lot of people, we appreciate a lot of people have not earned any money when the boxers haven't earned any money. But my belief is if they really want to do it and they're really dedicated to do it, they will come back. Of course, we will lose some. I appreciate that. And we will lose some promoters. I appreciate that. But the people with a good business plan, etc., and have things in order will come back and start promoting again. As I said earlier, the promoters at the present time, unless they have a contract with venues, etc., are not losing money because they're not promoting. The people who are losing money are the boxers and the trainers, etc. That's unfortunate, and as soon as we can get up and running, we possibly will. That's my big aim now. My big aim beginning of the year was to get the small hall shows up and running and look at ways of doing that, which would be financially viable. That doesn't mean that all the small hall promoters will start promoting again. I know that, but of course, this latest development is a bit of a kick in the teeth, and that's going to delay that even more now. But unfortunately, that's how it is.
Yeah, I think especially on the small hall circuit, you know, boxers have to sell the tickets, and without a crowd, they can't sell the tickets, and the promoters can't put on a show.
It's a chicken and egg situation, unfortunately. That's why the only people who can really promote are those with a TV or a broadcasting contract at this present time. Yeah,
and I think I read somewhere that to do all the testing and to make it a safe environment, you're looking in excess of 20,000. That's not even including venue costs and everything else that goes with it, ring costs, and obviously with no fans allowed in, it's just completely unviable.
Absolutely right. I mean, the testing is very expensive. Putting people into a so-called bubble is very expensive. And you know, as I said at the beginning of the whole of this, I was ringing promoters up who were hoping to run in March and April and May, telling them they shouldn't do it because it's financial suicide. As I say, I was criticised for that, but it's the truth. It's, you know, I want people, as I said at the beginning of the interview, I want people to be able to promote in the future, not go bust now. And that's where the sport needs us, needs the promoters in the future.
Absolutely. Just want to talk to you about the announcement in November from the government that publicly pledged 300 odd million to, I think it was the Winter Sports Survival Package, to help spectator sports in England. Obviously, this included rugby, horse racing and football, but it didn't include BOXIN. What was your reaction to this when it was announced?
Well, disappointed, but I think the problem that people don't understand is that boxing is very fragmented. So we have the professional side, which is run by the British Boxing Board of Control. Then you have each home country has its own association. Then you have the GB squad, which is funded by lottery money, etc. So there's finances there. The amateurs, there are funds available from the amateurs. It wasn't through that funding program there, but there are very small amounts, but there are, people look for it. I think the problem with professional boxing is that we are deemed to be a very rich sport because luckily some of our world champions and well-known boxers earn very good money. But of course, 85 to 90% of the boxers or people involved in the sport do not make any money or make very little money. So that's where the perception is wrong from the general public and from, I believe, the government. But since then, I've held meetings with Zoom meetings with England Boxing, Wales Boxing. I've written to Scotland, Boxing Scotland and Ireland, etc. We have one of our board stewards, Chris Evans MP, is the chairman of the all-party parliamentary boxing group in the government or in Parliament. And we are writing to Nigel Huddleston, the sports minister, with regard to funding for the sport as a whole and getting together as a group of people under one umbrella to see if that will make any difference with regard to funding. I have had correspondence with Mr. Huddleston. I've had a Zoom meeting with Mr. Huddleston. He seems to understand our predicament, and we are working on that and as coming together as a group with regard to funds. My main concern is although I'm not part of the amateur setup, is really the amateur clubs, etc. Because if those close, then and have been selfish, I suppose. Ultimately, some of those young boxers who are boxing now going into amateur gym will turn professional, and it's beneficial to us. So we need the amateur system to keep going and to be fruitful, and we need to help them the best we can, and we are doing it.
Do you think in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, because of this pandemic and because of a lot of the amateur gyms have to close and there's been no amateur tournaments, that this will have a detrimental effect in potentially bringing talent through to, say, the next Olympics or other amateur tournaments worldwide?
I think it could, but I don't think it's just boxing, is it? I think that can happen in football, that can happen in rugby, that can happen in hockey, that can happen in any sport, that people are stopped from taking part in an activity now may go and find other ways of entertaining themselves, etc. So yes, I think it can. I think at the present time with the GB squad and the Olympic squad, we're in a very healthy position. I think what Robert McCracken and his team have done with that is quite remarkable over the years. But of course that's funded as well. So I do think it's important that we try to keep everybody on track and give them the light at the end of the tunnel. This is going to get better. You know, this is going to get better. People may not think it's going to get better at the moment, but it is. We will survive this, and we'll be stronger for it. How long that takes, I don't know, but it will happen. I'm very confident. We are a good, strong sport. I believe we're well run. I believe the promoters in the country do a very good job around the country. I mean, last year, obviously our amount of shows reduced greatly, but previous to that was 270 shows. Previous to that was 255 shows. This is a strong industry. And luckily we put things in place to make sure that when we do have hiccups, we can survive. We will survive. Ultimately, boxing will survive. So if anybody thinks we're not, or thinks we're dead and buried, they're completely wrong. We will survive and we'll be stronger. Yeah,
definitely. Just lastly on that, I obviously recently saw AJ made a donation to his old amateur gym. Do you think that more elite professionals could do more? And I don't mean financially, I mean by being more vocal. And I want to use the example that Marcus Rashford did with school meals. He became very vocal, and the government then took notice.
Yeah, well, I think you're doing Anthony down a bit. I think he's funded he's donated monies to the home associations as well. But he's always been very, very supportive of Finchley. He realises what Finchley ABC has done for him as a young man and now a more mature gentleman, as you say, at the peak of his career. I think that sports people get a bad rap a little bit. I think they do more behind the scenes. They may not actually shout about it too much. But yes, I think it does help. I think what Mr. Rashford has done in football is remarkable. I think what Anthony has done for the amateurs is very generous and very good and should be applauded. But I do think other sports people and other boxers have been very supportive with regard to their old clubs and the amateur system, because they know where they've come from. It may be just not, unfortunately, good news isn't news sometimes, and people don't publicise it. You know, when something goes wrong, they like to publicise it. When things go good, they don't. But yes, it would be nice if people could become more vocal. Will people listen? I don't know, but you've got to try. And as I say, I think what Mr. Rashford and Anthony has done is fantastic, and more people can do it. Won't do any harm, will it? It'll be really good for the sport.
No, absolutely. I just want to go on to more positive aspect of this interview now. From your point of view, what has been success stories that have come out of this pandemic? And when I say success stories, like with you guys at the board, or what you've seen or what you've witnessed, and people coming together, etc.
I think the biggest success story is the sport itself. I think at one point everybody thought we were dead and buried. I mean, as I said earlier, you know, the first show was a British Championship in a television studio. Then we moved to Eddie's office's garden. I mean, that was quite a remarkable thing what he did there. Frank Warren then went to Church House at Westminster, which is a fantastic building. That was a great success. You know, we've had a British Championship, we've had Commonwealth Championships, we've had the first World Championship between two females, and we ended up with a World Heavyweight Championship. You know, Christ Almighty, what more do people want? I mean, ultimately, that is quite remarkable. But that, even in a normal circumstances, you'd think that was very good. So I think the sport has done very well. I think you're always going to have rivalries, but on the whole, I think the promoters have worked together reasonably well. There's obviously been a few spats along the way, but that's always the case. We haven't had many. I mean, right at the beginning of the problem of the issues, I did write to everybody and say, listen, you know, we would have difficulty if we had shows on the same night in the same area. We didn't have that for a long time. Then we did have clashes of dates, but they were in different areas, so therefore it wasn't a major issue for us. I would hope that can continue to begin with, and I think the promoters realise that. So I think the coming together has been good. I do think that when we started out, people did everything you said, ultimately did everything you said because they wanted boxing to get going. I do think a little bit, some people become a little bit complacent, but I think that's in society as well. And I think this actually has pulled everybody back in to see how serious it is. But that's just a human nature, ultimately, I think. But I think on the whole, the sport has come across it very well in a positive manner. Of course, there's things I don't really want to go into that haven't worked, but there's some things that's worked that I didn't think were going to be that successful. So as a whole, I think we've all done very well. You
mentioned women's boxing. When you first took over the role, you know, did you ever foresee that women's boxing would take off as much as it has done?
I think it needed the role models, and we didn't really have anybody then. But I think what has changed professional women's boxing is the success of the female boxers as amateurs. The trouble we have at the moment is the depth of talent. There's not that amount of depth of talent. The top is very good. You know, Katie Taylor, Terry Harper, Natasha Jonas, these people, you know, Rachel Ball, you know, these people, and Chantal Cameron, these people are very, very good boxers. But the depth of it is and I can't forget Savannah Marshall, you know, the world champion, etc., did a fantastic performance against Hanan recently. But the depth of female boxing in each division is quite low, it's small. But that will change because there's more female boxing in the amateurs now. And again, as I said earlier, whether male or female, they come to professional game later on. So there has been an increase in the talent. That has been because of the success in the Olympics and the GB squad and the money put into the amateurs, etc. So yeah, I mean, did I think it was going to be as good as it is now? Possibly not. Did I think it was going to be good? Yes, I think it was. I think the talent was always there. It's just nurturing the talent and get it out there. And it's taken, if you think about it from the London Olympics, it hasn't taken that long really for us to be a force in female boxing in the world.
No, absolutely. Do you think it'd be possible that we'll eventually see 3-minute rounds rather than the 2-minute rounds?
You can have 3-minute rounds. In Britain, you can have 3-minute rounds. I think Nicola Adam did a 3-minute round contest. So you can have 3-minute rounds according to the rules. If you fight for a sanctioned body championship, it's 2-minute rounds.
And just finally, do you think we'll see 2 women headlining a pay-per-view within the next year or 2?
I think it's possible. I think, I think pay-per-view is becoming more and more the norm. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I wouldn't like to say. But I think that we are going down the American model. But that's, I suppose, is that inevitable? It possibly is. That will, people won't be very happy about it, but that's the nature of all sport, I think, at the present time. Yeah, I think there's no reason why we can't have a pay-per-view with 2 female boxers. If it's a good contest, talented people will see it. It's no different from bums on seats at a venue. If it's a prospect of a good fight, people will go and watch it. And I don't see any reason why that can't be the case.
And just finally, do you think small hall boxing will return this year?
I hope so. I was very confident on New Year's Eve morning. What's happened since has clouded it somewhat. But no, I think it will. I don't think it won't be. I mean, I wouldn't like to give you a time period, to be honest with you, but I think in all essence, if you were looking, if a promoter was looking to promote, I think you're looking around about the new season. September sometime is maybe a time to think about it, because I don't think this is going away very quickly. I hope it does, but I don't think it is. I mean, it's got to give time for vaccinations to get going. That's not going to be around the country for a long time, and bearing in mind that we are dealing with fit athletes, so their time to get vaccinated is going to be way at the end of the year anyway. So I think it's a bit of an issue with regard to between now and the new season, but I think it can do. If somebody's brave enough to go along, there's no reason why they can't. There's nothing from us to stop them from doing it, other than the financial implication it has. And I think our promoters are too savvy to get work to not think about that. And it is obviously a major thought.
So I've just got one final question in regards to that. That if it does return, let's say there is a vaccination and it does return, let's say for September, do you think there still be hurdles that we need to jump through to put the show on?
Just run that by me again. Sorry.
So if let's say there is a vaccination and the shows, small hall shows do come back, let's say September, do you think there will still be things that they will need to put in place, i.e. what you guys have done with the TV shows?
Yeah, I think that things have possibly changed forever with regard to how we run tournaments. I think there will be changes. I think that the annual medicals may even change. There may be a requirement that everybody has to be vaccinated, before they can get a license. Like you have to have a HIV or a hepatitis B result. So that is something that may alter. That's up to the doctors, but it would seem reasonable to me. Hasn't been discussed yet. That's just my thoughts. But yes, I think there may be changes with regard to how we operate. But then I do think there's going to be changes how society works as well. So I don't think it's only just boxing. I think it'll be football, rugby, all the other major sports, etc., which we are a major sport. But I also think, the wearing of masks around towns and shops could be with us for a long, long time as well. So yes, I think this has changed the mindset of the vast majority of people.
Yeah, awesome. All right. I really appreciate you giving me your time